The kitchen knife felt lighter than it should have in Harley Green's right hand, slick with blood that wasn't his own, dripping onto the beige carpet of his bedroom, where everything had changed in the span of 11 seconds. He stood there breathing hard, watching the man on the floor curl into himself, hands clutched between his legs, screaming a sound Harley had never heard another human being make. High and animal and broken. His wife Rachel was pressed against the headboard, sheet pulled to her chin, eyes so wide he could see white all around the irises, and she wasn't looking at the bleeding man. She was looking at Harley like she'd never seen him before, like he was the monster, like the last 7 years of their marriage had just been erased and replaced with this single moment of violence that would define everything that came after. Harley had left the church at 9:30 that Tuesday evening, same as always after leading the evening prayer group. 23 people had shown up, which was good for a weeknight. They'd prayed for healing, for guidance, for strength in troubled times. Mrs. Henderson had requested prayer for her daughter's job interview. Young Timothy had asked for help with his father's drinking. Harley had laid hands on each of them, felt the familiar warmth of purpose flowing through his palms, believed in that moment that he was doing God's work. He'd been a pastor for 4 years at Redemption Community Church on the east side of Columbus, Ohio, a modest congregation of about 200 souls who trusted him with their confessions, their doubts, their desperate hopes for something better than the lives they were living. He'd driven home in his 10-year-old Camry, humming a hymn, thinking about the sermon he needed to prepare for Sunday. Something about forgiveness, maybe. About letting go of anger. He'd been feeling it lately. That low simmer of frustration that came from watching people make the same mistakes over and over, from pouring himself into a community that sometimes seemed determined to stay broken. But that was the work, wasn't it? That was the calling. Patience, compassion, meeting people where they were. The house was dark when he pulled into the driveway. Rachel's car was there, which meant she was home, but no lights burned in the windows. He'd felt the first whisper of something wrong as he'd turned his key in the lock, that animal instinct that lives beneath conscious thought, the one that kept our ancestors alive on the savannah. The house was too quiet, not the peaceful quiet of evening, but the held breath quiet of something hiding. He'd climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking under his weight, and he'd heard it then, the rhythmic creak of their bed frame, the sound he knew intimately because it was the sound of his marriage bed, but hearing it when he should have been the only one home made it foreign and terrible. His hand had found the bedroom doorknob. He'd turned it, and there they were. Deacon James Whitmore, 52 years old, married to Sandra for 28 years, father of 3 grown children, one of the church elders who'd interviewed Harley for the pastor position 4 years ago, the man who'd shaken Harley's hand with both of his own and said, "We're blessed to have you leading us." And that same man was on top of Rachel, moving with her in a rhythm that belonged only to husband and wife, her legs wrapped around his back, both of them so absorbed they hadn't heard the door open, hadn't felt Harley standing there watching his entire world crack apart like ice under too much weight. He'd stood frozen for 3 seconds. 4. 5. Long enough for the image to burn itself permanently into his brain, every detail sharp and merciless. The way Rachel's fingers dug into James's shoulders, the sound of James's breathing, heavy and urgent, the pile of clothes on the floor, her blue dress she'd worn to work, his church clothes, the same gray slacks and white shirt he'd worn to Sunday service just 5 days ago. Then James had looked up, seen Harley, frozen. Rachel had screamed. Harley had walked to the kitchen, his body moving on autopilot, his mind somewhere else entirely, somewhere white and empty where nothing could hurt him. He'd opened the drawer, taken out the 8-inch chef's knife they used for cutting chicken, walked back upstairs with no plan, no thought, just a roaring in his ears like standing inside a waterfall. James had been trying to get his pants on, hopping on one foot, saying something Harley couldn't process through the roaring. Rachel was crying, saying Harley's name over and over, but it sounded like it was coming from miles away. Harley had looked at James and seen every lie, every handshake, every prayer they'd shared, every time James had called him pastor with that respectful nod. He'd seen Sandra Whitmore's kind face as she'd brought casseroles to church potlucks. He'd seen their children, good kids who came to services and volunteered for mission trips. He'd thought about God, about sin, about righteous anger and judgment, and all the scriptures that talked about punishment for adultery. His hand had tightened on the knife handle. James had his pants halfway up, was backing toward the door, hands out, saying, "Harley, wait, we can talk about this. Just put the knife down." Harley had moved fast, faster than he knew he could move. He'd tackled James to the floor, and James had fought, but Harley had rage and betrayal fueling him, and James had only surprise and fear. They'd struggled for maybe 10 seconds, maybe less, James trying to grab the knife, Harley pulling it back. And then Harley had seen his target, had thought in some primal part of his brain that if this man had used his manhood to destroy Harley's marriage, then his manhood should be destroyed too. An eye for an eye, a betrayal for a betrayal. The knife had been sharp. They'd just had it professionally sharpened 2 weeks ago. It cut through denim and flesh with less resistance than Harley had expected. James's scream had been immediate and piercing, and Harley had looked down at what he'd done and seen blood pumping between James's hands, saw what he'd removed, and the white emptiness in his mind had shattered into 1,000 sharp pieces of realization. He'd just mutilated a man. He'd just committed assault, maybe worse. He was a pastor who'd brought violence into his own home, who'd let rage override everything he claimed to believe about mercy and forgiveness and turning the other cheek. Now he stood there with the knife, and Rachel was screaming actual words now. "Oh my God, call 911, he's going to die." And James was on the floor, making that terrible keening sound, and Harley thought with strange clarity that this was the moment his life divided into before and after. Before Harley, who'd been a good man, a man of God, a man who helped people, and after Harley, who would be defined forever by the worst thing he'd ever done. He dropped the knife. It hit the carpet with a soft thud. His hands were shaking. The whole room smelled like copper and sweat and sex, a combination that made his stomach lurch. "Call 911, he said, and his voice sounded normal, almost calm, which seemed impossible. "Call them now." Rachel scrambled for her phone on the nightstand, punching numbers with trembling fingers. She was crying so hard she could barely speak, but Harley heard her saying, "We need an ambulance, my husband. There's been an accident. There's so much blood." Not an accident, Harley thought. Be honest. Call it what it was. An attack. A mutilation. A crime born of rage and humiliation and the total destruction of everything you thought was true about your life. James had stopped screaming. That seemed worse somehow. He was making a low, moaning sound now, rocking slightly, his face gray and slick with sweat. Harley knelt beside him without thinking, that pastoral instinct still alive somehow underneath the violence, and pressed his hands over James's hands, adding pressure to try to slow the bleeding. "Don't touch him!" Rachel shrieked. "Get away from him!" But Harley kept pressure on the wound, and James looked up at him with eyes full of pain and terror and something else. Shame, maybe, or regret. Harley couldn't tell and didn't care. He just kept pressure on, the way he'd learned in the first aid training the church had required, and thought about how strange it was to be trying to save the life of the man he'd just tried to destroy. The sirens came quickly. Columbus had good emergency response times in this neighborhood. Harley heard the front door crash open, heard heavy footsteps pounding up the stairs, and then the room was full of paramedics in dark blue uniforms, moving with practiced efficiency, pushing Harley aside, cutting away James's pants, packaging the severed parts in ice, starting IVs, loading James onto a stretcher while he moaned and twitched. One of the paramedics, a young woman with her hair in a tight bun, looked at Harley and said, "Are you injured? Is any of this blood yours?" Harley looked down at his hands, his shirt, saw the red smears and splatters, and shook his head. "No, it's his." "Did you see what happened?" He almost laughed. Did he see it? He did it. He was what happened. "Yes," he said simply. The police arrived as the paramedics were carrying James down the stairs. 2 officers, one older with gray at his temples, one younger with a buzz cut and hard eyes. The older one looked around the bedroom, at the blood on the carpet, at Rachel still pressed against the headboard with the sheet clutched to her naked body, at Harley standing there with blood on his hands and clothes and face. "I'm Officer Ramirez," the older cop said. "This is Officer Chen. Someone want to tell me what happened here?" Rachel spoke first, words tumbling over each other in her rush to get them out. "My husband came home and found us, James and me, and Harley went crazy. He attacked James with a knife. He cut him. You have to arrest him. He's dangerous." The younger cop, Chen, moved closer to Harley. "Sir, I need you to put your hands where I can see them." Harley raised his bloody hands slowly, palms out. He felt strangely calm now, floating somehow outside his own body, watching this scene play out like it was happening to someone else. Chen pulled Harley's arms behind his back, and Harley felt the cold metal of handcuffs click around his wrists. "Harley Green," Chen said, "you're under arrest for felonious assault. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Do you understand these rights as I've explained them to you?" "Yes," Harley said. His voice still sounded eerily calm. "I understand."
Sí.
Ramirez was talking to Rachel now, getting her version of events, and Harley heard her saying between sobs that, yes, she and James had been having an affair for 6 months, that Harley didn't know, that she'd planned to tell him but hadn't found the right time, that she never imagined he'd react with such violence. 6 months. The words hit Harley like a physical blow. Half a year of lies. Half a year of James sitting in the front pew during Harley's sermons, nodding along, saying amen. Half a year of Rachel kissing Harley goodbye in the morning and betraying him by evening. Chen walked Harley down the stairs, one hand on his elbow, guiding him like he was an elderly person who might fall. Outside, the neighborhood had come alive. Lights blazed in windows. People stood on their porches and lawns, watching the spectacle. Harley saw Mrs. Patterson from 3 houses down, holding her robe closed at the throat, saw the Collins teenagers filming on their phones, saw Jerry Martinez from across the street, who came to church sometimes, standing in his driveway with his mouth open. They'd all know by tomorrow. The whole congregation would know. The whole city would know. Pastor loses his mind, mutilates church deacon in act of revenge. It would be on the news, in the papers, online. His face and name and worst moment broadcast for entertainment and judgment. Chen helped Harley into the back of the patrol car, one hand on top of Harley's head to keep him from hitting the doorframe, the same way Harley had seen cops do it in movies, except this time he was the criminal. He was the one in handcuffs. He was the villain of this story. The door slammed shut. Through the window, Harley watched another ambulance arrive, this one for Rachel, who'd need to be examined, checked for shock. He watched Ramirez talking to the paramedics, pointing back at the house. He watched more police arrive, saw them string yellow crime scene tape across his front door. His home was a crime scene now. His bedroom, where he'd slept beside Rachel for 7 years, where they'd made love and talked about their dreams and held each other through hard nights, was evidence of his violence. The drive to the police station passed in a blur. Harley stared out the window at the familiar streets of Columbus, saw them transformed into something alien and hostile. Every stoplight, every building, every person walking a dog or waiting for a bus. They were all part of a world he no longer belonged to. He'd crossed a line tonight, stepped over a boundary that separated the good people from the bad, and there was no stepping back. At the station, they processed him like he was a package being shipped somewhere. Fingerprints, photos, front, side, holding a placard with numbers. Inventory of his belongings, wallet, phone, keys, watch, wedding ring. That last one hurt. They slid it off his finger and dropped it in a plastic bag, and Harley thought about the day Rachel had put it on, the way she'd smiled at him, the promises they'd made. Love, honor, cherish, forsaking all others. She'd forsaken. He'd failed to cherish. They'd both betrayed the promises, just in different ways. They put him in an interview room, a small windowless space with cinder block walls painted institutional beige, a metal table bolted to the floor, 3 chairs, a mirror that Harley knew was one-way glass. He sat handcuffed to a ring in the table and waited. His mind felt sharp now, the shock wearing off, replaced by a creeping horror at what he'd done. He kept seeing it in his mind, the knife, the blood, James's face contorted in agony, kept hearing that scream. Detective Laura Simmons came in 40 minutes later. She was in her mid-40s, dark hair pulled back, wearing slacks and a blazer, carrying a manila folder and a cup of coffee. She sat across from Harley and studied him for a long moment before speaking. "I'm Detective Simmons," she said. "I'll be investigating what happened tonight. Before we talk, I need to make sure you understand your rights. Officer Chen read them to you at the scene?" "Yes." "And you understood them?" "Yes." "Do you want an attorney present before we talk?" Harley thought about it. He knew he should say yes. He knew that's what any lawyer would tell him to do, that anything he said could only hurt him. But part of him wanted to confess, to explain, to make someone understand how the world had looked to him in that moment when he'd walked into his bedroom and seen his marriage being destroyed. "I'll talk to you," he said. Simmons opened the folder, pulled out a pen. "Tell me what happened tonight, in your own words. Start from the beginning." So, Harley told her, about leaving the church, about coming home to the dark house, about the sounds from upstairs, about opening the bedroom door and seeing James on top of Rachel. He told her about the knife, about the rage, about the moment when rational thought had been swallowed by a primal need to hurt the man who'd hurt him. He didn't try to justify it or minimize it. He just told the truth. Simmons took notes, her pen scratching across the paper, her face neutral and professional. When Harley finished, she was quiet for a moment, then said, "Did James Whitmore threaten you? Did you feel your life was in danger?" "No." "Was he armed?" "No." "Did you attack him because you believed he was going to harm you or your wife?" "No. I attacked him because I was angry, because I'd been betrayed." Harley met her eyes. "I'm not going to lie to you, Detective. What I did wasn't self-defense. It was revenge. It was wrong, I know that." Simmons studied him. "You're being very cooperative, Mr. Green. Most people in your situation aren't this forthcoming." "I'm a pastor," Harley said, then corrected himself. "I was a pastor. I teach people about accountability, about facing the consequences of your actions. I can't do that for others and not do it for myself. You understand you'll likely be charged with felonious assault? That you're looking at significant prison time?" "Yes." "And you understand that your cooperation now won't necessarily help you later?" "I understand. I'm not talking to you because I think it'll get me a better deal. I'm talking to you because it's the right thing to do." Simmons closed the folder. "I need to be honest with you, Mr. Green. In my 15 years doing this job, I've seen a lot of domestic situations that turned violent. I've seen crimes of passion, heat of the moment stuff. But what you did tonight, the specific nature of the injury you inflicted, that's going to be very hard for a jury to sympathize with. That's not throwing a punch in anger. That's not even stabbing someone in a rage. That was targeted, specific, calculated to cause maximum humiliation and permanent damage. I know. Do you? Do you really understand that even if people sympathize with your situation, even if they think what your wife and Mr. Whitmore did was terrible, they're still going to be horrified by your response? You didn't just hurt him. You mutilated him. You destroyed part of his body. That's going to be really difficult for people to forgive. Harley felt something twist in his chest. I don't expect forgiveness, he said quietly. I don't deserve it. Simmons stood. I'm going to recommend they hold you without bond. You're not a flight risk, but the nature of the crime and the victim's prominent position in the community means the prosecutor will push for remand. You'll probably have an arraignment tomorrow morning. What about James? How is he? He's in surgery. I don't have an update beyond that, but I'll tell you this. If he dies, you're looking at murder charges. If he lives, you're still looking at years in prison. Either way, your life as you knew it is over. She left. A uniformed officer came in, removed the handcuffs from the table ring, and walked Harley down a hallway to booking. They gave him orange scrubs to change into, took his blood-stained clothes as evidence, and led him to a holding cell. It was small, maybe 8 by 10 feet, with a metal bench bolted to the wall, a toilet in the corner, and harsh fluorescent lights that never turned off. There was one other person in the cell, a thin man with hollow eyes who lay on the bench, staring at the ceiling, and didn't acknowledge Harley's presence. Harley sat on the floor in the corner and put his head in his hands. Now, finally, away from the police and the questions and the need to explain himself, he let himself feel everything he'd been pushing down. The grief of losing his marriage, the rage at Rachel's betrayal, the horror at his own actions, the fear of what came next. It all crashed over him at once, and he started to cry, silently at first, then in great shuddering sobs that shook his whole body. He thought about his mother, who'd raised him alone after his father left, who'd worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table and still found time to take him to church every Sunday. She'd been so proud when he'd gone to seminary, when he'd been ordained, when he'd gotten his first congregation. What would she think now? She was 73, living in a retirement home in Cleveland, and tomorrow someone would have to tell her that her son, her good son who'd devoted his life to God's work, had committed an act of brutal violence. He thought about his congregation. They'd trusted him. They'd brought him their problems, their sins, their secret shames, and he'd counseled them with compassion and wisdom. He'd told them that God loved them no matter what, that forgiveness was always possible, that violence was never the answer. And now they'd see him for what he really was, a hypocrite who couldn't live up to his own teachings, a fraud who'd preached peace while harboring rage in his heart. He thought about James, somewhere in a hospital operating room, doctors trying to repair what Harley had destroyed. James with his easy smile and firm handshake. James who'd sponsored the youth group's trip to the homeless shelter. James who'd led the church finance committee and helped them stay out of debt. James who had a wife and children who loved him, whose life was being ripped apart right now, just like Harley's. And he thought about Rachel. Rachel, who he'd met at a coffee shop 8 years ago, who'd laughed at his jokes and listened to his sermons and said yes when he'd asked her to marry him. Rachel, who'd stood beside him through his ordination, through the challenge of leading a congregation, through the lean years when the church struggled financially. When had it gone wrong? When had she started looking at him differently, seeing him as someone to betray rather than someone to trust? Had he been so focused on the church that he'd neglected their marriage? Had he failed her first, and her affair was just the symptom of a deeper problem? The questions circled in his mind like vultures, and he had no answers, just a growing sense of desolation that felt like drowning. He'd lost everything in one night. His marriage, his career, his freedom, his reputation, his sense of himself as a good person. He'd become someone he didn't recognize, someone capable of violence he'd never imagined himself committing. The night passed with terrible slowness. Harley didn't sleep. He sat in the corner of the cell, and watched the fluorescent lights hum and listened to the sounds of the jail. Doors clanging, voices echoing, someone screaming in the distance. At some point, guards brought breakfast, a tray with runny eggs and burnt toast and coffee that tasted like chemicals. Harley couldn't eat. His stomach was a clenched fist, rejecting everything. At 8 in the morning, they came for him. Handcuffs again, a walk through more hallways, then into a courtroom where other prisoners in orange scrubs sat in a jury box waiting their turn before the judge. Harley recognized a public defender he'd met once at a community event, a young woman named Jennifer Cho, who looked barely old enough to be out of law school. She sat beside him and spoke in a whisper. "I've been assigned to your case, Mr. Green. This is just the arraignment. The judge will read the charges and enter your plea. I'm recommending we plead not guilty at this stage. We can always change the plea later if we reach a deal with the prosecutor. But for now, we preserve all your options. Do you understand?" "Yes. The prosecutor is going to argue for remand, which means they want you held without bond until trial. I'm going to argue for reasonable bond, but I have to be honest with you. Given the nature of the crime and the media attention this is getting, I don't think the judge is going to grant it. You'll probably be held in county jail until trial." "When will that be?" "Could be months, could be a year. The system moves slowly." Harley nodded. A year in jail before his trial even started. Then years in prison after conviction. The rest of his life defined by one night of rage. The judge called his case. The State of Ohio versus Harley Green, case number CR 2024-8756. Charges are felonious assault in the first degree. "Mr. Green, you're represented by the public defender." "Yes, Your Honor," Jennifer Cho said, standing. "How does the defendant plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor." The prosecutor, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a red tie and comb-over, stood. "Your Honor, the state requests that the defendant be held without bond. The crime here is particularly heinous, a premeditated attack that resulted in permanent mutilation of the victim. The defendant poses a clear danger to the community, particularly to the victim and potential witnesses." "It wasn't premeditated," Harley said, standing before his lawyer could stop him. "I came home and found them together. I didn't plan." The judge banged his gavel. "Mr. Green, you'll have your chance to present your defense at trial. Sit down." Harley sat. Jennifer Cho put a hand on his arm, a warning to stay silent. "Your Honor," Cho said, standing again, "my client has no criminal record. He's a pastor, a respected member of the community. He's not a flight risk. He's been completely cooperative with the police. We ask that reasonable bond be set." The judge looked at Harley for a long moment, and Harley saw something in his expression. Not sympathy exactly, but a kind of weary sadness, like he'd seen too many people destroy their lives and was tired of witnessing it. "Mr. Green," the judge said, "I've read the police report. I understand you walked in on your wife in a compromising situation. I understand you felt betrayed and angry. But we live in a society of laws, not vengeance. You didn't call the police. You didn't leave the house and get a lawyer. You went to your kitchen, got a knife, and attacked a man who posed no threat to you. The nature of that attack suggests a level of rage and loss of control that concerns this court. I'm remanding you to the county jail to await trial. No bond." The gavel came down. Harley felt hands on his arms, pulling him to his feet, leading him out of the courtroom. He caught a glimpse of people in the gallery, reporters with notebooks, strangers come to watch the show, and in the back row, Sandra Whitmore, James's wife. She was staring at Harley with an expression he couldn't read, something between grief and rage and incomprehension. He wanted to say something to her. "I'm sorry. I destroyed your husband. I destroyed your family." But the guards were already pulling him away, back through the halls, back to the holding area, and then into a transport van with other prisoners, and they drove through Columbus to the county jail, on the west side. The intake process at County was more thorough than at the police station. They made him strip completely, bend over, cough, looking for contraband, for weapons, for drugs. They sprayed him with something that smelled like industrial cleaner, gave him new orange scrubs and rubber shoes, took another mugshot, assigned him a number, 745289. That was his identity now, not Pastor Harley Green, just 745289. They put him in a cell block with 40 other men, two-man cells lining 2 tiers, a common area with bolted-down tables, and a TV that played cable news constantly. Harley was assigned to a cell on the upper tier with a cellmate named Deshaun, a 23-year-old kid in for drug possession who took one look at Harley and said, "You're that pastor, ain't you? The one who cut that dude's dick off." News traveled fast. Harley said nothing, just climbed onto the top bunk and faced the wall. "Man," Deshaun said, "that's cold. Respect, though. Dude was sleeping with your wife. He had it coming." "No one has that coming," Harley said quietly. "You say that now 'cause you in here, but I bet when you did it, you felt like you was justified, right? Like you was God's judgment or whatever." Harley closed his eyes. Had he felt justified? In the moment, had some part of him believed he was meting out righteous punishment? He didn't know. The rage had been so complete, so all-consuming, that there hadn't been room for thought, only action. The days bled together. Wake at 6 to lights and bells. Breakfast in the common area. Hours of nothing, sitting in the cell or at the tables, watching other inmates play cards or dominoes or chess with pieces made from rolled paper. Lunch, more nothing. Dinner, lights out at 10. And through it all, the constant noise, men shouting, guards barking orders, metal doors slamming, the TV blaring news and sports and game shows. Harley tried to pray. He'd been praying his whole adult life, felt God's presence as a constant companion, but now, when he closed his eyes and tried to form the words, he found only silence. God had left, or maybe Harley had left God. He'd committed an act of violence that violated everything he'd claimed to believe, and now the divine presence that had sustained him felt absent, like a friend who'd finally given up on him. Jennifer Cho came to visit 3 days after the arraignment. They met in a small room with a guard outside, sat across from each other at a scarred table, and she spread papers between them. "I've been reviewing the evidence," she said. "The police report, the witness statements, the medical records. I'm not going to sugarcoat this, Mr. Green. The case against you is very strong. You confessed to the police. There are witnesses, your wife, several neighbors who heard the screaming. The physical evidence is overwhelming. If we go to trial, you'll almost certainly be convicted. So what are my options?" The prosecutor is willing to offer a plea deal. You plead guilty to felonious assault. They recommend a sentence of 8 years. You serve probably 5 with good behavior. 5 years. Harley would be 43 when he got out. Middle-aged. An ex-con, a registered violent offender. No chance of ever being a pastor again. No chance of a normal life. What happens if I don't take the plea? We go to trial. We try to argue temporary insanity, crime of passion, extreme emotional disturbance. Maybe we get lucky and a jury sympathizes, but more likely you get convicted and the judge gives you the maximum, 15 years. Plus, we'd have to put you on the stand, and the prosecutor will tear you apart. They'll make you relive what you did in front of the jury, make you describe it in detail. They'll bring in medical experts to testify about the permanent damage. They'll call character witnesses who'll talk about what a good man James Whitmore was. It'll be brutal. Harley thought about it. 5 years, certain, versus the chance of acquittal, but more likely 15 years. It wasn't really a choice. "There's something else," Jennifer said. "James Whitmore survived the surgery. They were able to reattach part of what you severed, though the doctors say he'll have permanent dysfunction. He'll never have normal sexual function again. He's suing you in civil court for damages, medical expenses, pain and suffering, loss of quality of life. Even after you serve your time, you'll probably be paying him for the rest of your life." "Good," Harley said. The word surprised him, but he meant it. He should pay. He should spend the rest of his life making restitution for what he'd done, even though nothing could really make it right. "The prosecutor also wanted me to tell you that Mrs. Whitmore is pregnant, 6 months. She only just found out about the affair when all this happened. Now she's dealing with her husband's injury and his infidelity and trying to decide if she stays in the marriage. The prosecutor wants you to understand the full scope of the damage you caused." Pregnant. Sandra Whitmore was going to have a baby, and her husband was mutilated and traumatized, and their marriage was destroyed, and it was all Harley's fault. He felt the weight of it pressing down on him, crushing the air from his lungs. "I'll take the plea," he said. 8 years. I'll take it." Jennifer nodded. "I'll let the prosecutor know. We'll schedule the plea hearing for next week." She left. Harley went back to his cell and lay on his bunk and stared at the ceiling. 8 years. He'd be 45. His mother would be 81 if she lived that long. The world would move on without him. Rachel would divorce him, probably remarry. The church would hire a new pastor. His life would be a cautionary tale people told about what happens when you let anger control you. Deshawn was playing cards with some guys in the common area. Harley could hear them laughing, talking trash, living their lives even in this confined space. How did they do it? How did they accept their circumstances and find moments of normalcy, even joy? Harley felt like he was drowning, like every breath was an effort, like the weight of what he'd done would never lift. That night, he dreamed of the bedroom. In the dream, he opened the door and saw Rachel and James, but this time he didn't move, just stood there watching, and they looked at him and kept going, like he wasn't even there, like he was a ghost. He tried to speak, to scream, but no sound came out. He was invisible, powerless, already erased. He woke to the morning bell and lights and the realization that the dream was a gift. In the dream, he'd done nothing, and that was its own kind of hell, witnessing betrayal and being unable to act, unable to matter. In reality, he'd acted, and now he was paying the price. But at least he'd been real. At least he'd existed in that moment, even if it was the worst moment of his life. The plea hearing happened on a Friday morning. They brought Harley to court in shackles and sat him beside Jennifer Cho at the defense table. The prosecutor read the charges and the terms of the plea agreement. The judge asked Harley if he understood what he was agreeing to, if anyone had coerced him, if he was mentally competent to make this decision. "Yes, Your Honor," Harley said to each question, "and you understand that by pleading guilty, you're admitting you committed this crime, that you won't be able to appeal the conviction?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Mr. Green, do you have anything you'd like to say before I accept this plea and impose sentence?" Harley stood. He saw Sandra Whitmore in the gallery again, sitting in the same back row, her hands folded over her pregnant belly. He saw reporters with their notebooks. He saw a few members of his congregation, Mrs. Henderson and her daughter, Timothy and his mother, Jerry Martinez. They'd come to watch him fall. "I want to say that I'm sorry," Harley said, his voice shaking. "What I did was inexcusable. I let rage overcome reason. I caused terrible harm to James Whitmore and his family. I violated the principles I claimed to believe in and teach. I hurt my wife, my church, my community. I can't take it back, and I can't make it right. But I want everyone to know that I accept full responsibility for my actions. I'm not asking for mercy or understanding. I'm just saying that I'm sorry, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be better than I was in that moment." He sat down. The judge looked at him for a long moment, then said, "Mr. Green, I accept your guilty plea. I sentence you to 8 years in the Ohio Department of Corrections. You'll be eligible for parole after serving 5 years. I'm also ordering you to pay restitution to the victim in an amount to be determined by the civil court. I recommend you to the court that you receive counseling and participate in anger management programs during your incarceration. This court is adjourned." The gavel came down. Guards stepped forward, and Harley stood and let them lead him away. He took one last look at the courtroom, at the faces watching him, and then he was back in the hallway, back in the holding cell, and eventually back in the transport van, heading to prison intake. They sent him to Marion Correctional Institution, a medium-security facility 2 hours north of Columbus. The intake process was familiar by now. Strip search, delousing, medical exam, psychological evaluation, assignment to a cell block. They gave him a prison ID card with his photo and number. They gave him sheets and a pillow and a set of rules. They told him to keep his head down, follow orders, and maybe he'd get out in 5 years. His cellmate at Marion was an older man named Robert, 58, serving 10 years for embezzlement. Robert had been an accountant, had stolen from his firm to pay gambling debts, and now he spent his days working in the prison library and his evenings reading thick novels. He was quiet and kept to himself, which suited Harley fine. The days at Marion had more structure than county jail. Wake at 6. Breakfast. Work assignment. Harley got kitchen duty, washing industrial pots and pans for 8 hours a day. Lunch. More work. Dinner. Rec time in the yard. Evening in the cell. Lights out at 9. Repeat. Every day the same. Harley tried to find meaning in the routine. He worked hard in the kitchen, showed up on time, followed every rule. He went to the chapel services on Sundays, though he sat in the back and didn't participate. The chaplain, a Baptist minister named Reverend Thompson, tried to talk to him a few times, but Harley wasn't ready. What could he say to another minister? How could he explain what he'd done? After 3 months, Jennifer Cho came to visit with news about the civil case. James Whitmore was suing for $2 million in damages. He'd had multiple surgeries, ongoing medical issues, severe psychological trauma. The civil court had found Harley liable. Since Harley had no assets, they'd garnish any wages he earned in prison and after release until the debt was paid. $2 million, Harley said. I'll never pay that off. I'll be paying him for the rest of my life. Probably, Jennifer agreed. I'm sorry, Harley, but this is the reality of what you did. The consequences don't end when your prison sentence ends. After 6 months, Rachel came to visit. Harley almost refused to see her, but curiosity won out. They sat across from each other in the visiting room, separated by a scratched plastic barrier, speaking through phones. She looked different, thinner. Her hair was shorter. She wasn't wearing her wedding ring. I filed for divorce, she said without preamble. It'll be final in a few weeks. Okay. I wanted to tell you in person, and I wanted to tell you that I'm sorry, not for leaving you. I think we both know the marriage was over before that night, but I'm sorry for how you found out. I'm sorry for the pain I caused you. Harley felt nothing. He'd expected anger or grief or something, but there was just numbness. Are you still with him? With James? No. God, no. That ended the night it happened. He's trying to work things out with Sandra. I don't know if they will. But I'm alone now. I moved to Dayton, got a job at a different company. I'm trying to start over. Good luck with that. She flinched at the bitterness in his voice. I know you hate me. I don't blame you. But I want you to know that I never meant for any of this to happen. I never wanted you to get hurt. Then you shouldn't have slept with a member of my congregation in my bed, Harley said. You shouldn't have lied to me for 6 months. You shouldn't have destroyed everything we built together. But you did. And I'm in here because I let your choices turn me into someone I never wanted to be. So yeah, Rachel, you hurt me. But I hurt myself more. She was crying. I'm so sorry, Harley. I'm so sorry. I know. Me too. The visit ended after 20 minutes. Harley went back to his cell and lay on his bunk and felt the numbness crack just slightly, enough to let in a sliver of grief. He'd loved her once. Maybe he still did, somewhere underneath the anger and betrayal. But it didn't matter. That version of his life was gone. That version of himself was gone. He was 745-289 now, inmate, convicted felon, man who'd committed an act of brutal violence. Nothing could change that. After a year, his mother came to visit. She was frail now, needed a walker, but she'd made the trip from Cleveland because she said she needed to see her son. They sat in the visiting room, and she held his hands through the barrier and cried. "I raised you better than this," she said. "I taught you that violence was wrong. I taught you to love like Jesus loved. What happened to you, Harley?" "I made a mistake, Mom, a terrible mistake, and I'm paying for it." "Are you asking God for forgiveness?" Harley didn't know how to answer that. He'd stopped praying months ago. The silence from heaven had been too complete, too devastating. Either God wasn't listening, or God had nothing to say to a man who'd committed such violence. Either way, Harley felt abandoned. "I'm trying," he lied. "I'm trying to be better." She left after an hour, and Harley knew it would probably be the last time he saw her. She was too old, too frail to make the trip again. He'd disappointed her, destroyed the pride she'd felt in him, and now he'd lost her too. The years crawled by. Harley worked in the kitchen. He read books from the library. He exercised in the yard. He avoided trouble, kept his head down, served his time. Other inmates came and went. Some tried to befriend him, curious about the pastor who'd mutilated a man. Harley didn't talk about it. He became known as quiet, reliable, boring. That was fine with him. In year 3, Reverend Thompson finally broke through. Harley had been sitting in the chapel, not praying, just sitting because it was quiet and empty, when Thompson sat down beside him. "You know," Thompson said, "I've been a chaplain for 15 years. I've counseled murderers, rapists, men who did terrible things. And the ones who make it, the ones who find some kind of peace, they all have one thing in common." "What's that?" "They accept forgiveness, not just from God, but from themselves. They realize that what they did doesn't define all of who they are. It's part of their story, but not the whole story." "I cut off a man's genitals because he slept with my wife," Harley said flatly. "That's a pretty defining act." "It is, but it's not all you are. You were a pastor for 4 years before that night. You helped people. You did good work. That's real too." "How can both things be true? How can I be both the man who helped Mrs. Henderson's daughter find a job and the man who mutilated James Whitmore?" "Because you're human. Because we all contain multitudes, good and bad. The question isn't how you can be both. The question is what you do next. Do you let the worst thing you ever did be the last word, or do you find a way to redeem it, even just a little?" Harley thought about that for a long time. After the conversation, he started going to the chapel services. He didn't participate much, just listened. But he started to feel something again, some small opening in the wall he'd built around himself. Not forgiveness exactly, not peace, but maybe the possibility of those things someday. In year 4, he got a letter. It was from Sandra Whitmore. He almost threw it away without reading it, but something made him open it. "Dear Harley," it began. "I don't know if you'll read this. I don't know if you should, but I need to say some things, and this is the only way I know how. What you did to my husband was terrible. You hurt him in ways that can never be fully healed. You destroyed our family in a single night. I hated you for a long time. I still hate you sometimes. But I've been working with a therapist, trying to understand and process everything that happened, and she helped me see that you were in pain too. That doesn't excuse what you did. Nothing excuses it. But it helps me understand that you're not a monster. You're a person who made a terrible choice in a moment of terrible pain. James and I are still together. It's been hard. He's had to work through his own shame and guilt about the affair. I've had to work through my anger at both of you. Our baby is 2 now, a little girl named Grace. Sometimes I look at her and think about how close I came to losing everything. James could have died that night. You could have killed him. And then what? You'd be in here for murder, and my daughter would have grown up without a father. The weight of that possibility, of how much worse it could have been, helps me find some compassion for you. I'm not saying I forgive you. I don't know if I ever will, but I'm saying that I see you as human, and I hope that wherever you are, you're finding some way to live with what you did. Sandra. Harley read the letter 3 times. Then he sat down and wrote back. He thanked her for her words. He told her he was glad James survived, glad they were working on their marriage, glad their daughter had both parents. He told her he'd spend the rest of his life trying to make amends, even though he knew it could never be enough. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just acknowledged the weight they both carried, the ways their lives had been permanently altered by one night of violence. She wrote back. They corresponded slowly over the next year, maybe once every 2 months. The letters were never warm, never friendly, but they were honest. Sandra told him about Grace's first steps, first words. Harley told her about the classes he was taking, the counseling he was doing, the ways he was trying to understand his own capacity for violence. They became something like pen pals bound together by trauma, neither forgiving nor forgetting, but finding a way to exist in the same world. In year 5, Harley went before the parole board. Jennifer Cho had prepared him, told him what to say, what not to say. He sat across from 3 board members and answered their questions honestly. Have you participated in anger management counseling? Yes, for the entire 5 years I've been incarcerated. Do you feel you understand why you committed this crime? I do. I let rage overcome reason. I felt betrayed and humiliated, and instead of walking away or seeking help, I chose violence. I made the worst possible choice. If you're released, what are your plans? I have a job lined up at a halfway house in Cleveland. I'll be working maintenance, helping with the facility. I'll continue counseling. I'll work to pay my restitution to the victim. I'll try to rebuild some kind of life, though I know it won't look anything like the life I had before. Do you think you deserve to be released? Harley paused. No, I don't think I deserve it, but I hope I've earned it. I've served my time. I've done the work. I'm not the same person I was 5 years ago. I can't change what I did, but I can be better going forward. They deliberated for 2 hours. Then they called him back in and told him he was approved for parole. He'd be released in 30 days. The day he walked out of Marion Correctional, Rachel was not waiting. His mother had died 8 months earlier. He'd been allowed to attend the funeral in shackles, had stood in the back while they lowered her into the ground. The congregation from his old church had moved on, hired a new pastor, forgotten about him. He had no one. But Jennifer Cho was there. She drove him to Cleveland, to the halfway house where he'd spend the next 6 months transitioning back into society. It was a big old house on the east side, filled with other ex-cons trying to find their way. Harley had a small room with a twin bed and a desk and a window that looked out on a tired neighborhood. He got the maintenance job. He fixed toilets and painted walls and mowed the lawn. He attended AA meetings, even though he didn't drink, because the structure helped. He met with a counselor twice a week. He paid what he could toward his restitution, knowing he'd never pay it all. After 6 months, he moved into his own apartment, a studio in a building that accepted felons. He got a job at a hardware store, stocking shelves and helping customers. He lived quietly, kept to himself, tried not to think too much about who he'd been and what he'd lost. One Saturday afternoon, 2 years after his release, he was working at the store when someone called his name. He turned and saw Timothy, the kid from his old church, now grown into a young man of maybe 25. "Pastor Harley," Timothy said, uncertain. "I wasn't sure if it was you." "It's me," Harley said, "though I'm not a pastor anymore." "I know. I followed what happened. I'm sorry." "Don't be. I earned it." They talked for a few minutes. Timothy was in college now, studying social work. He told Harley he'd been inspired by Harley's work at the church, the way Harley had cared about people others ignored. "Even after everything that happened," Timothy said, "I still think about the things you taught me. About compassion and second chances. About how everybody's carrying burdens we can't see. That shaped me. So thank you." After Timothy left, Harley stood in the hardware store aisle and felt something he hadn't felt in 7 years. A small spark of redemption. He'd done something terrible. He'd hurt people, destroyed lives, violated everything he'd claimed to believe. But before that night, he'd also done good. He'd helped people. He'd mattered in positive ways. Both things were true. He would never be a pastor again. He would never have the life he'd planned. He would carry the weight of what he'd done for the rest of his days. But maybe, possibly, he could find small ways to make amends, to be better, to add something good back into a world he'd made worse. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't redemption. It was just survival, and the faint hope that survival might someday become something more. Harley went back to stocking shelves, one box at a time, building a life from ruins, haunted and humbled, and still, somehow, still here. One box at a time, building a life from ruins, haunted and humbled, and still, somehow, still here.